That's the world.
Okay.
Did you get Austin's email? He wasn't going to be able to be here.
I talked to him yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
And
make
then I sent him the link this morning.
Okay.
Yeah, so he should be good. He has not signed on yet, but he should be good.
I'll let him know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I responded to it as soon as I got it, so
Yeah.
it is what it is. I'm recording it, so we've got to come up with a different plan for him in general, for you know, what he's got going on.
Yeah.
And it's not, you know, that's not an uncommon thing. It's just, he and I are going to talk next week.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah, he had just.
he's got a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
It's rough. It's like, we got to get you signed up for Saturday.
I did sign up.
You got it? All right, good. All
I
right.
didn't get it from you. Parker was like, he sent it to me, but not you. And I was like,
We're gonna talk after that entire group. So
I used Parker's link, but I got all signed up for.
that's fine.
Saturday.
You did.
It isn't because of waste. Yeah, but it's radiation emitted by coal plants, which is super ironic.
How are we all doing? Are we good? We survived the lab exam. Are we ready for the next one next week? Kinda. Yeah, it's a 5-day away problem. Yeah. The math answers for the practice questions are up on Canvas. I uploaded them this morning. Okay. Your exam will look very similar to that practice exam. I have to figure out exactly how long it takes me to do the math, which I timed this morning, so that I know that I give you like 3 times that amount. So you will have enough time to do the math. Make sure you have your phone, and I will be you know, basically I'll have to find a way to monitor your phone. So I may end up walking around to make sure you don't have anything else pulled up on your phone as you're doing stuff. Yes. Sure, that makes my life way easier. Absolutely. And I strongly encourage it because it lowers my issues with other things. Hey. It's okay, you didn't miss anything important. Actually, you did. If you have a calculator, it's preferred to your phone. Okay. If you have any other questions about the math or want to talk to me, you have to let me know ASAP. I probably will not be around on Monday. I will be around tomorrow. I've seen a couple students, talked to a couple students already. So I'd be happy to try to walk you through any questions you have. It's just, I have my own issues with my schedule in terms of things that are due, that I have to meet mine, you know, own timeline. So I will try to work with you as best I can. It may mean a Zoom meeting, but whatever. For those of you that signed up for the CWD extra credit, except you, because you're done. We need to talk after class, so stick around. This lecture will not be on the test. Okay. You're excited about that, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Any other questions? We'll get going on next. It'll be on your last exam. One more exam for lecture and lab. Sarah has graded, I think, almost all the lab exams. So those grades will go up probably beginning of next week. We've got one student that has a health issue that we has to make up the test. Okay. For the sake of time. Anyway, So we're gonna start moving away from math, which is good for a lot of you, I think. At least that's what you tell me. To a little bit more into like habitat management, specific management strategies for certain situations as it relates to wildlife. So less biology and more habitat management. Okay. And we're going to start off with silviculture and forest management. Who's, so Mr. Disney, you're in silviculture right now, correct? Anybody else in silviculture? And then we have, how many folks have had silviculture? 2. Do not let me murder anything. Okay, I know just enough silviculture to get myself into trouble. Anyway, let's put things into perspective and why we care about forest management. First and foremost, forests are a big component of our country, right? And then you start thinking about if you are in the East, it's even more so a big part of the landscape. And therefore, if it's a large component of the landscape, it is an area that wildlife can exist. It's a natural ecosystem, and we have to manage it as such. Things have changed just from historical pre-European settlement. We kind of talked about this in one of the first lectures as it relates to Kentucky and what Kentucky looks like now. Historically, forests were probably close to about 70-ish% of our actual landscape. Now, what the forest kind of look like, right? So you have a difference between a woodland and a forest. Anybody know the difference between a woodland and a forest? Yeah, it's more of a savanna-like, right? So some interspersed trees with taller grass underneath. Probably very much managed by buffalo historically. But overall, quite a bit of deciduous forest. You can see how we had a good chunk of prairie as well, which is also pretty important. And we're down to like 1% of our native prairie remaining in most places. Things have transitioned. We have maintained a good chunk of forested habitat within the state relative to historical. Does anybody know what we sit at in terms of the composition percentage? 49%. 49%, yep. So we're still, it's a big part of our state. The majority of it is still located in the eastern part of the state because frankly, it's hard to put cows and cornfields on these hills. It's just the other agricultural uses are limited because of the topography. But it doesn't mean we can't manage the forest to try to keep it as healthy as possible. And, you know, even though this hasn't changed in terms of what's growing there and what's making up the landscape, what that forest looks like now versus historically is vastly different. What's probably the biggest change in our modern forests in Eastern Kentucky versus pre-European settlement? Well, just the forest, not what surrounds the forest.
And split up, scattered because of.
So you've got some, yes, so a little bit of fragmentation. But what outside of fragmentation, that's loss of forest. So what about the forest itself? How is it different?
There's no ash.
Well, that's actually up here. That's currently, we're losing ash at a rate that's through the roof.
There's no chestnut.
Yes, no chestnut, right? Parker, what's that? What is? We're going to talk about that in a second. So why do you, so the 3 forestry students back there, what historically, do you know what the composition was for chestnut percentage? I'm going to tell Laka that was your answer. 70-ish, 60 to 70% in certain areas. So it was the main tree. And in terms of wildlife, why do you know what, like why we were missing it the most?
Palatable hard mouse.
Consistent, super abundant, extremely palatable hard mast. And when 70% of the trees in the forest are dropping hard mast every year in massive supplies, what do you think that does for our carrying capacity? Through the roof, right? So why we probably had ridiculous amounts of bear, elk, eastern elk, not the elk we have now, deer, which currently their populations fluctuate a lot based on how good the oak mast is, which is not as good of a production system as the chestnut was. So, and then finally, what also happened that made our forest a little different? I mentioned fragmentation, but there was another big event.
Reduction of fire.
Well, that, yes, kind of. What else? If you drive down, how many of you have gone down to Eastern Kentucky? No, well, a lot of them no. That's surprising. So when you drive through Eastern Kentucky and you look at the forest, is it all kind of look similar? Trees are all about the same size, same age. There's basically no old growth there. Why? What was that?
We logged a lot of it.
We logged almost all of it. Right? So we had an event where all of this was basically cut over at least once, probably 2 or 3 times. Yes.
Why is the current map, is there like one spot of coniferous forest?
Well, that's a good question. Probably because it's planted, but it's probably, so that would be, that'd be Northern Daniel Boone. So this is Lexington, Winchester, Mount Sterling, Southeast. I don't know. I'll find out. Yeah. That is odd. I never noticed that before. But if you look at, so old growth forest is a major missing component because we cut everything over. So the tree, there really aren't any trees that survived that event. So you can't have old trees if you kill them all or cut them all at one point. However, we can try to predict where old growth can occur in the future so that you can try to protect those forests for management goals, whether that be certain wildlife species that need old growth, or there's a lot of folks that want to have old growth present. If you are managing for timber production, is old growth something you want? No. Why? Yeah, so where do you reach your maximum yield in terms of time?
Depending on what you're cutting, if it's white oak, like 80 years.
Yeah, so after that point in time, you don't gain as much wood per year as you do. So that's the point where, so we talk about maximum sustained yield for harvest for wildlife. There's maximum sustained yield for timber production. And at a certain point, if you get an oak tree that's 140 years old, you're not actually gaining a lot of timber per year. It takes a long time for them to get big and you're not getting better quality timber. So in terms of timber management, you've already passed your peak production. So that's why, you know, all of our trees are all about the same age, even in managed forests. Now, to Parker's point about how our forests are changing in terms of composition towards maples, what's the term for that? Does anyone know? Transition for regeneration away from oaks towards maples and beech. The name. Correct. So that has been happening mostly due to, we believe, a couple things, but fire, lack of fire in the landscape favors maple and beech trees. Maple and beech species are not as resistant to fire because of the way their bark is structured. They also do better in humidity conditions created by lack of fire. And actually complicate the situation by their leaves that they put on the floor are not as good fuels. So they basically make the environment that favors them. What is changing on a larger scale is, even though that is going on, and we had this transition to maple and beech and birch up north, with climate change and how that's going to impact us, it actually takes that and switches it, and it's actually going to favor oak and hickory long term for us, mostly because of temperatures and drought. Oaks, hickories do much better in drought systems and fire systems, because drought is going to mean more fire than maple and beech. So we're going to see a transition towards oak and hickories in much of the Northeast. So if you like maple syrup, you might want to start stocking up on it. Real maple syrup.
Did you say fires benefit oak and hickory?
Oh, yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. All right. But long-term population viability of wildlife species, if you're thinking about what certain species may require maple, beech forests, you have to be looking at this and going, okay, we need to start thinking of how we can mitigate climate change for those species. That's especially true the further you get north, where aspen and birch species, there's a lot. So, moose, elk, grouse, several small passerines are highly dependent on that aspen system. And as it warms, they're going to go further and further north. So they're going to lose basically their entire food and cover supply. So a lot of the management strategy is, how do we actually save not these populations, but these populations? Because we've lost this. Does that make sense? Good. So to put things in perspective, back to Kentucky, and we have, and the reason this is up here, so this is all historical data on timber production for Kentucky. And you can see we have actually slightly declined historically. We were doing a lot of cutting in the 90s and 80s, and even before that. Things have slowed down a bit, and it depends a lot more on timber prices. But why we care? Well, to be honest, we care because when we look at who owns the forest, it's basically almost 80% of our forests are owned by private individuals. 13% are owned by companies, and those could be mine or timber production companies, leaving us 9% of forests available for us to actively manage with not having to get anyone's permission. That's not a lot to work with without really dealing with things. And this is on mostly national forest, which if you try to do anything on a national forest, it takes 5 years to get through the NEPA process. They have forest timber or timber cuts, so harvests that have been going through paperwork for 8 years, trying to get in place on the Daniel Boone, which are solely meant to benefit grouse and early successional forest bird species. And they still can't get through. So it's not the greatest situation. So if you're looking at what we care about, is what are the messages that get to landowners that help them manage their forest? And timber harvest is one of them, because it's an economic benefit. So where do our trees go that are harvested? For the most part, we ship our logs elsewhere. And this is kind of actually increased recently. You can see this is all kind of old, but I need to get the updated economic data. We have actually been loading a lot of our logs that are harvested into shipping containers and sending them to China, because that is where the market is paying the most for them. We have a vibrant economic timber industry, forestry industry in the state, we're about $13 billion of economic impact. That includes products made from our timber, as well as the actual sale of the logs to the landowners and so on. But a good bit of it stays here, but we ship quite a bit of it out. What do we make out of those trees? Well, what are those? Yes, we make a lot of bourbon barrels. And this is the change over previous years. This has been increasing steadily, right? How many bourbon barrels are sitting in Rickett houses currently? You may know. It's more, there's more bourbon barrels than there are people in Kentucky. It's over 5 million. And we're about to have some on campus here for the Distillery Institute. So the thing that, from the wildlife management perspective, what are those bourbon barrels made out of? White oak, right? Only white oak. All right. White oak is a highly valuable wildlife species because of the mass production, right? Acorns it produces a lot of them. They're highly nutritious. In addition, oaks in general support the most diversity of lepidoptera species. So moths and butterflies. Major food item for bats and birds. We are cutting white oak at a rate that's probably more than is sustainable for the state and in general the range. We also have some oak harvest going on for other production, right? This could be furniture, flooring, and whatnot. This would also include red oaks, so it's not just white oak. So we remove a lot of oak. So you have to be thinking about ensuring that there's enough oaks in the forest to support whatever wildlife goals the landowner may have. You also have a high value on being able to regenerate, so produce more oak saplings to fill out that gap of harvest. The other thing you could take from this that's important from wildlife perspective is pulpwood, so stuff that gets made into paper. That's been declining steadily, and our companies that would process those items, there's fewer and fewer of them, and they're further and further away. Pulpwood comes from all the saplings and basically smaller trees in an area that get harvested. So stuff that is not merchantable for logs would get left if there's no market to sell. That usually means crap stuff that has not a lot of value to wildlife or to landowners for timber production, right? Does that sound right, Jimmy, Parker, Mikey? Yeah, yeah. But this, if we do things, and we're going to talk about regeneration cuts. So the young forest, how do we get young forest? Well, you take out all the big trees, right? There's a lot of little trees that are in there too. And if it's not economically viable for the logger to take them, they leave it. This is how you make it economically viable. So we're having to deal with this problem, the email problem of less paper being needed in the economy. So how do you then get all the products, the wood leftovers out of the forest so you can get the regeneration that you want to get the habitat? That makes sense. Yes.
So the less paper is a problem, you're saying?
It's a problem for wildlife management.
We can't get
early successional forests on the ground because they don't take enough trees out.
How do you use like pulpwood markets to finance your management of records?
Yep. So this is where I should have had Josh Frazier come in, who's the wildlife forester. Should have him do this lecture. Because we can do things on public ground that the ultimate goal is the management of the ground. So we can meet objectives way easier than, say, trying to convince a landowner to meet certain forestry objectives. where they are going to look at how can I potentially have the economic benefit. Well, we can get early successional habitat in by paying loggers to do a little more work to cut down and take out that stuff that is not there. If a landowner, if you tell a landowner, well, it's really good to get that stuff out, but you're going to get $400 less an acre in income, they're going to have to make that decision of is a songbird worth $400 less in my pocket per acre? How often do you think that decision goes in the wildlife's favor?
Never.
Not never. It does.
Never.
Almost never. There are folks that will make decisions based, and we tend to try to get them engaged in active management because they are willing to make that sacrifice. They also tend to not have financial issues, right? So they tend to be a little bit more fiscally secure and therefore make decisions based on their values rather than whether or not their kids eat. So, Southeast Kentucky, economically depressed area, landowners, human dimensions come in wildlife management. How do you think that may affect decisions on forest management? There's other things called high grading, where they're only taking the trees that are worth the most money and leaving the crap trees. Long-term effects of that. So just bigger picture. All right. What we're going to talk about now is the actual idea of silviculture, right? Which is what all of our management strategies are based on for forestry, is the idea that we can manipulate forest vegetation to basically come out with outcomes that are predictable that we want to meet management goals. Okay, those can be species composition, they could be age classes, vegetative structures, and so on. And almost all of it is based on the idea of plant succession and knowing that if you let a forest or an area go, it has a predictable path that it will follow in each area. The big assumptions here, and luckily we meet these assumptions in the East. In the West, we're seeing some issues, especially in the areas where the extreme fires are happening, where they can actually create just nothing but black soil and all the entire seedbed's gone, along with some of the soil, that areas may not recover naturally from from disturbances. And you have to look at logging, or you should look at logging as a disturbance mechanism in the landscape. It is a tool we use to cause a change in the vegetation in the landscape. There's other tools that we use: fire, herbicide, lawn mowers for grasslands. All those things change and set back the process of succession. We know in the East, if we do certain things at certain times, we can basically understand the outcome that will happen in the forest. And that's one of our assumptions. We also know that the disturbances we use approximate the disturbance that used to occur that allow us to predict the outcome. Okay, those are your two big assumptions. So things naturally occur and reproduce, and we can do things and know what's going to happen when we do things. There's a couple major groups or procedures of silviculture prescriptions. The forestry kids get a lot of training on these, but you all are just going to, outside of them, the rest of you are just going to get a very brief overview. They spend semesters working on this because that's what their job's going to be. Usually, from a wildlife standpoint, we tend to partner with a forester because their understanding of silviculture is much more advanced than ours. We have an idea how things work. They are the expert, right? That's what they went to school for. So the big groups are reproduction methods. So a prescription to remove trees so that you can establish a new stand in some fashion. That may mean different compositions, completely starting over, planting, and so on. We get into some site preparation methods that will help prepare an area for a harvest or a regeneration of young trees. And then you get in, and these are much more common for us, because we already have trees in much of our landscape that we're doing this, are activities that basically help guide the development of the stand, the forest stand. And a forest stand, well, actually, Parker, can you give me a good definition for a forest stand?
A stand would be a delineated area within a forest, trees that have similar characteristics.
Okay.
So they can kind of be grouped together, and you can propose a management plan for that general area.
Usually have similar slopes, soil content, those kind of things, right? And when the soil and the slopes are very similar, you tend to get very similar species composition, growth rates, and so on. So that would kind of, so you use the idea of the stand, that similar setting, as your management entity, because it allows you then to predict the outcome of that area. All right. Other kinds of reproduction methods, even age management, where majority of the trees within the stand are about the same age or size, similar either time of establishment or similar time to harvest. Uneven age management is usually utilized, especially from the timber production side, where you consistently, on a consistent rotation, have trees every 15 to 25 years that can be harvested that are reached their basically their timber production peak. But you consistently have new regenerating trees coming up behind them. All right. We would call this basically a healthy forest. All right, for the most part. But all of these have a place in the landscape. So to give you an idea, so this would be an even age stand. Almost all the trees are at their peak height, right? Their diameters are all pretty similar. So if these were all young, it would still be an even age stand. But they're, you know, for the most part, all larger. Uneven, right? So you got some that are really tall, older, larger diameters, and you have some that are popping up, and then everything in between. Okay. Why does that matter in terms of wildlife? Well, think of things in terms of either food or cover. So a lot of times, you may have this situation, right? It benefits certain wildlife species, maybe some songbirds in the upper components are bugging out, right? You may get good production of certain seeds, mast. However, if you are a terrestrial mammal or a ground-dwelling songbird, you have nothing here. So it's void of habitat. Situations you see very similar tree size, tree diameter. So tree diameter is basically diameter of the tree at breast height, okay? Are all pretty similar. Most of your foliage cover is at the top of the canopy. You get into a uneven age, so you have bottom layer, top layer varies. You see a little bit better distribution of diameter, okay? And there's cover from top to bottom. That can also occur, so you don't have a lot of gaps. So you basically have pretty much sporadic placement of younger trees underneath the older trees, usually where there's a gap in the canopy that the sun can come down. If you look at a gap opening, right? So there's areas where there's no larger trees, a lot This scenario is still different from here, even though they have a little bit different cover amount, but it's distributed the same. This is within a spatial area, cover can be clumped together at a locale. All right. Here it's generally spread out. So if you think about it, a grouse that is walking around in this forest and a hawk is sitting in a tree. Is it going to be seen easier than a grouse walking around in here? No. So if you're the grouse, which one are you picking, left or right? Here, walking around. And remember that those little trees that provide cover at ground level are sporadic. Here, they're all bunched together. So which one would be right? Basically, a hawk sitting in this tree can't access anything here. A hawk sitting here can still probably find a gap to grab a grouse. Yeah.
How much does like perching, like the hawk has more areas of perch to, how much is that better?
Well, so perching is important if they can access what they're hunting. So if they're perching here and this is a pasture, then they can very easily access mice or rodents or whatever else. If this is, as generally happens in an early settled forest, a place that is full of brambles, briars, young trees that no one in their right mind would want to walk through, let alone try to fly and hit the ground. That's the difference.
How do you get to the graph, the second one, that there's gaps in the small trees? If you look at it like there's like the same amount of small tree item.
So, and that's kind of the point is, though in terms of where the foliar cover is, it achieves similar distribution in terms of total area. This has different characteristics than this. It's why grouse need this and really can't survive in that. So there's minutia at spatial scales that you can't get this, that situation from looking at this. You have to have a little bit more information. All right. So there is, what you need to know is rotationally, so the time between harvests, there's a point that a stand is at its economic climax. Trees will decline in value at a certain time because they start developing problems in their actual timber itself. So generally a forester who's managing for timber production is going to try to get to the point where the stand is worth its most money and apply the harvest there. Or try to do prescriptions that may change this point and increase the value of certain trees within the stand while harvesting others. All right. The message that we like to send folks is if you're not actively managing your forest, you're losing out in two different ways. One, you're not providing wildlife with all the habitat they need, depending on what species you're managing for. And at a certain point, you actually start losing money. Okay. So let's kind of get a look at some images of those cuts and types of cuts or harvest prescriptions, as we prefer to say now. So a single age harvest, what used to be called a clear cut commonly, and it's still called a clear cut by folks that are against them. We call it a regeneration harvest or a gap harvest or a stand harvest. What other terms pop up you guys use for, that's about it, isn't it? Yeah. The way to think about it is a complete removal of all vegetation in that stand. All right. So you get a big opening. It is not pretty. especially the first year or two. But from a wildlife standpoint, and what we know from a forestry standpoint, is what this is gonna look like in 2 years is a ton of soft mass producing vegetation like brambles, grapes, and then all kinds of tree saplings popping up that creates basically early successional forest habitat, lots of cover and lots of food, lots of plant diversity and lots of insect diversity. That's where this is important for wildlife. What this picture is from, though, is not from the east. What you see is something you'd see in the south or in the Pacific Northwest, where all of these are the same tree. This is a managed forest for timber production solely. We don't have that in Kentucky. That's something you see in the southeast and the northwest. So it's slightly different, but it really illustrates what's going on. We tend not to have a lot of folks that do this exact thing. But if you think about it, with all these prescriptions, we need to think about and help you gauge is that as you let light hit the forest floor, you get a lot of regeneration. All right. What that regeneration is depends, but for the most part for wildlife, it's young trees and a lot of soft mass producing vegetation. So more food and more cover. So the more light that a prescription lets in, the more early successional wildlife habitat you create. Okay. This is what grouse specifically need to survive. That's one of the things we don't see a lot anymore. But it is really actually needed heavily for grouse and many of our neotropical songbird migrants. Other 2-age stand harvest strategies. So these are variable retention. So you have different amounts of trees you keep back for different reasons. Shelter wood harvest, you're selecting trees to kind of shade out certain species because certain trees regenerate better in open sun versus shade. Parker, what tree species benefit from a shelter wood harvest versus a complete clear cut? So this one is one you basically prescribe if you want to increase oaks in the landscape. Okay. Seed tree harvest, similar, but this one is used sometimes when you're trying to shift the composition of the regeneration towards certain tree species. So you leave species that are the seed source that hopefully then increase their seed available on the ground in the seed bank, therefore creating more of that tree species in the long term. Also can be done to try to leave certain trees that may benefit certain wildlife species. So we do this a lot with shagbark hickories for bats because it creates that roosting habitat underneath the bark that they like, along with opening up the area that they forage in. So it would be called a leaf tree in that sense. And then finally, you have a deferment harvest. What you're doing is you're selecting certain trees to leave behind to either generally improve their quality in the short term. Short term is a 10 to 20 year basis. So it may be that you have certain oak trees or hickory trees that are close to being a marketable size. However, they may be crowded out by other trees. And then therefore competing with for sunlight. So you can remove the trees around them, give them a canopy gap that lets more sunlight come in, burst in growth, and they reach that marketable value quickly. So what does a shelter wood harvest look like? You can see that there's plenty of larger trees left in the stand that was cut. And that'll achieve the shading on the ground that's necessary to favor oaks. What that actually looks like in real life, something like that. Generally, you're trying to look at basal area, so the amount of vegetation above you, because that tells you how much light's hit the ground. So what, 25 to 45 for shelter wood, 15 to 35, what is it? 15 to 35 basal area retention for shelter wood. So a full canopy will be somewhere around 140 to 150 usually. So you have basically an 80% to 90% reduction of basal area, amount of vegetation in the canopy. Seed tree, you tend to get a lower basal area retention, so maybe 5 to 15, depending on the trees that you're leaving and how much they're present in the stand. A lot less trees, right, that are there. You'll get shading underneath those trees, but not achieving the goal that you would have for a shelter wood. So in this sense, you're actually trying to shift towards those species. Okay. Then the deferment, this picture is really bad, but it's starting to pick out a tree here that they're trying to favor. They're trying to remove its competition next to it, with the ultimate goal then of doing a harvest after. It's not really a deferment harvest if you're not going to actually harvest the trees that you're managing for later on. Okay. There's other harvesting strategies that can occur in a stand, including single species selection, which unfortunately is what's happening a lot right now in our stands in Kentucky for white oak. Right, so they're taking out only the white oak in the stand, which means it removes all seed sources, along with not creating the environment that favors future oak growth. They're leaving everything else there. It can be used for good, right? You can remove things that have no value or little value for wildlife or forestry. Generally, that's harder to do because the economics that are behind it. So there's a different, another type of harvest called group selection. And this is kind of think of a clear cut or regeneration cut on a small scale. We'll get to the image of it, but basically it can be an acre, acre and a quarter, acre and a half, or smaller, where you're removing a lot of similar sized trees in one spot. So you're creating basically just Swiss cheese in the forest, okay? So single selection, in terms of how the stand would look, so you can see that you're only taking out certain trees that fit whatever that criteria is. You're not opening up the canopy very much, and it depends on what type of tree you're taking and what that stand composition looks like after. Group selection, so this is the Swiss cheese idea, right? So you have small little holes that you take out all the trees that are present. So you get light hitting the ground, so you get small sections of early successional habitat popping up. If you do this close together, like we have done in Robinson Forest, you get a different type of forest structure that has both mature trees, early successional habitat immediately adjacent to each other. There's a lot of wildlife species that depend on both those things. So you put them right next to each other, we're finding out is they do wonderfully. Bats being one of them, and our T&E bats, so our threatened and endangered bats, especially being one of them. So this appears to be a really sustainable method for harvesting for wildlife, especially our threatened and endangered bat species. If you ever go down to Robinson Forest, you can take a 45-minute ride to the very back end of it and actually see that in action. It's kind of cool. So one of the other groups of activities, right, is the site preparation. And this plays a role on the front end of harvest or regeneration, how you prepare that site to advance in structure in the future. So that can be, you know, things like actually artificially planting trees, where you go in and actually are doing the regeneration by putting whatever trees you want in place. You can do certain methodologies that encourage trees to succeed in that location. And then you can also take out materials that help make room for trees to grow. Basically, they fall into mechanical prep and herbicides. So what that would look like, things like scarification, windrows are all site prep. Windrows are basically the gathering of material and placing in the landscape. This is one that's used a lot for erosion control on hills. You use the materials, especially post-harvest, to stop water from building up a lot of steam on the slopes, and it therefore prevents erosion. Okay. The scarification, this is really done quite a bit to basically work the leaf litter and the soil together. There's a lot of species that have smaller seeds that are lighter that don't get in underneath that leaf litter. Therefore, they don't get soil contact and they dry out and die. So scarification, by basically simply roughing up the soil and mixing them together, gets them the soil contact they need to regenerate and hopefully produce trees. There are natural events when this happens. One of them is like wild turkeys are basically little scarification machines because as they walk through the forest, they scratch and look for acorns. And what they're doing is actually scratching up dirt and moving leaves and intermixing them. They're not as efficient as a mechanical tool, but ecologically they're doing the same thing, just not at scale. The downside, right, is if you have a leaf litter that is continuous, that promotes fire. So scarification can reduce fire, but if you're trying to promote fire dependent species, then it causes a problem. It does alter your floral diversity. You're only going to favor certain species, not just trees, but other plant species on the ground layer. So you have to understand the impacts of it before you prescribe it. Also, you tend to see a drop in productivity because of the disturbance event and the way it goes. You get some soil compaction issues, especially if you're using heavy equipment. That alters the ability of plants to basically grow with the same vitality they had previously. Other prep tools, herbicides can be used in two different ways. They can be used to kill existing trees to open up the canopy without harvest, or they can be used to reduce competition at the ground level, where you may be removing invasives, grasses, or other small trees that tend to just take over, that do better in those conditions. So you can try to basically achieve some management goals by using herbicides to prepare the environment to favor certain species that you're managing for. In addition, herbicides can create things like the dead trees that are snags that are useful habitat for wildlife. Unfortunately, because you tend to use this on a smaller tree, you don't get the life of the snag that you would get from a larger tree diet. All right, this is done a lot, especially for grapevines, which can cause major problems in timber production stands. Grapevines are great wildlife habitat. However, they cause issues for timber production that we clearly saw with the ice storms we had this past winter, where as those vines went up, they start pulling down on branches, cause trees to break, branches to break, and therefore losing the value of that tree. Okay. All right, so intermediate treatments. This is what's happening as the stand gets older. So you start looking at treatments to change the composition or direction of the stand, usually 20 plus years into its growth. It can happen at any point the stand is going, depending on your management strategies. But what you're doing is you're either changing the composition of the stand or trying to promote vigor in certain trees. They can also, if the tree is healthier and growing faster, it tends to have a higher disease resistance as well. The act of thinning can, depending on the method you use, can cause a major disturbance on the forest floor. So certain thinning tools can be a simple, really early harvest of some trees, or an actual going in and cutting larger trees down. In the field semester course that our forestry students took last year, we went in and thinned out a stand that caused us to fell 80 some trees. The act of those trees falling and where those remnants are changes that landscape and can cause problems for some of the trees that are remaining. Okay. Tend to basically remove unmarketable trees. And if you have a pulp market there, you may be able to get it into a commercial harvest. But usually what you're trying to do is, from the forest standpoint, is make better conditions for the timber, highly valued timber trees. Okay. Other treatments, prescribed fire can achieve two things. It can reduce mid and understory vegetation, which can compete with trees, regeneration, so you can release them, allow the younger trees to basically have less competition and grow quicker. You can kill undesirable, or hopefully kill undesirable species like maples and beech. So you can shift towards oaks, hickories, or you can try to reduce the likelihood of a major fire event or other snags from being present in the landscape. Foresters do not like snags, because would you want to walk under a dead tree all the time, which has a possibility of falling on you? So the less snags in a stand, the safer they are. It's never a fun conversation to tell a forester to create snags or to leave certain snags in an area. Loggers have the same problem. They don't like dead trees hanging out while they're working. Okay. So what does thinning look like? It may happen in multiple stages. You may go in and remove certain larger trees to open up growth for those, right? So you get a markable thinning or a composition with it. The hope is that as you move along, your trees that you leave are getting bigger and more marketable. Or instead of marketable, shift towards more food production or cover for wildlife. Okay. They do quite a bit of this in managed timber stands for pine production, but we do quite a bit in hardwoods as well. Fire and prescribed fire, for those that are not aware, is not what you see on the news when the fires are out west. Those are happening and they're an issue because of the fuel loads that are present for the fire are high, and therefore the fire can take off. Usually with prescribed fire, you're looking at low fuel levels or known fuel levels that allow you to manage them. And the flames generally are about a foot tall to 18 inches tall. Now, outside of the forest, when you're burning grasslands, which is also a tool used for that, to set it back, to stop trees from taking over, grasses tend to provide more fuel I've seen flames as high as 25 feet in a grass on fire. So it's not as contained, but you build better barriers around it. Building barriers in the middle of a forest is not easy, but it can be done without a bulldozer.
So like 5 different prescribed fires on I-74, I-75 this past weekend.
It is time for fall burning season. You can do, so when you burn matters because the temperature of the burn causes different outcomes. It's a different level of disturbance. So cooler burns actually may not get the beech maple kill that you want. So you have to do it when you have more fuel or better temperatures to burn in to get a hotter burn to achieve those goals. All right. This is the last slide, Malia, so you're good. So you have to have a somewhat of an understanding of fire science to make sure you're getting those goals met for your management strategy. Okay. That's what I got for silviculture. More than likely, if you go into wildlife, you start working with a forester and you pick this up pretty quick. There's a lot of intricacies, and a lot of them depend on where you are and what the stand structure is in that location. All right. With that, we are going to call it a day. Questions for the test on Tuesday, don't hesitate.